Well, hello, friends and fans. Alright, let's do that again. Alright. Well...
Hello, friends and fans. Today we're going to be exploring the world of interactive story-driven games, but with a horror twist. In fact, we're going to compare two games which stand out somewhat above the rest. One being a pioneer of the genre in Untitled Dawn, and the closest thing to a successor in The Quarry, both developed by Supermassive Games. Untitled Dawn was initially released on the 25th of August 2015 as a PlayStation exclusive, being published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. Though, recently, a new remastered version has been announced. Cannot wait to see Emily slap Ashley in high definition.
I'm sorry.
The Quarry was released on the 10th of June 2022 on PlayStation, Xbox and PC, this time published by 2K. Between the two games' releases are 7 years. They aren't narratively linked in any way, their only similarities being the same developers, the same genre and similar functionality, but these factors are enough to warrant a comparison in my opinion. On Metacritic, both have received the exact same Metascore of 79. A Metascore is essentially an average rating from reputable sources, so both have favourable critical review. But interestingly, the user score has a considerable difference, with Untitled Dawn standing tall with an 8.3 and The Quarry sat with a 6.1. It's also worth noting that as of this recording, Untitled Dawn has 3,863 user reviews, whereas The Quarry has only 426. But I would suggest that despite the difference, this is still a good enough sample size to get a general feel for the audience reactions to each game. With 7 years difference and time to innovate and refine whilst developing other similar games such as the Dark Pictures anthology, why is the audience score so different between the two games? That's the purpose of this video. We're going to explore why this might be. To do this, we're going to discuss important elements of the interactive narrative genre, starting with the idea of player agency and its impact in a virtual space. We'll discuss narrative structure and storytelling, before reflecting on ludology and how to develop a sense of immersion. We'll follow up with a more detailed breakdown of both Untitled Dawn and The Quarry, comparing key elements of each game, including their controls, plot, characters, and choices, before giving my final thoughts on each game. I'll give a brief introduction of each game as well to set the scenes. Untitled Dawn begins with a group of friends throwing a house party out at the Washington Family Mountain Lodge during some heavy snowfall. All whilst unknowingly, an ominous individual lurks outside the window. A character named Hannah Washington is tricked into believing her crush, Mike, liked her back, when secretly nearly all of her friends were watching, filming, and laughing at her as she began to undress.
It was just a prank, Han.
Embarrassed, she runs into the snowstorm, being quickly chased after by her concerned sister Beth. Upon reuniting with her sister, both find themselves pursued by an unknown entity, before being cornered upon a cliff edge, and ultimately falling a great distance and striking the rocks beneath. A year later, the group of friends return to the cabin to attempt to move past this tragic event, invited by their friend Josh, the brother of the now two missing sisters, not knowing what Josh truly has planned, that a stranger is stalking them, or that something else haunts this mountain. The Quarry introduces us to a couple of counsellors arriving a day early for camp. Before long, they swerve off the road, avoiding a peculiar humanoid figure hunched in the road. A character named Laura wanders into the forest and finds a dog cage, and is then haunted by a ghost, after which she runs back to the car, where she and Max receive some help from the creepy local officer. They then make their way to Hackett's Quarry summer camp. Before long, Max finds himself attacked by a beastly creature locked in the now open basement, and Laura is sedated by the strange police officer.
Does this look like the goddamn Harbinger Motel to you?
We fast forward to the end of summer and meet a group of counsellors. As the children leave the site, Chris Hackett, the camp leader, is keen for the counsellors to leave on time. Unfortunately, one of those counsellors, Jacob, is keen to spend one more night together with his friends and sabotages their car before Chris needs to rush off in a panic. Some mysterious hunters arrive on the scene, watching from afar as the eventful night begins. I'm a big fan of the interactive narrative genre, having played through both of these titles multiple times already, and I'm fresh off another playthrough just prior to making this video. But just because I enjoy a game doesn't mean it's without flaw, so let's get started with maybe the most important element of interactive storytelling: choice.
Bitch.
Agency is generally understood to refer to our ability to act in the world. One of the most prevalent definitions is that of Murray's in 1997, who defined agency as the satisfying power to take meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices. Agency is synonymous with choice, and by agency we are referring to a player's feeling of control within a situation and the impact of that decision they make. So within an interactive narrative, it could be the difference between choosing to run or to hide, and this choice may lead to a character's survival or demise. There are three main categories of choice in video games: mechanical, strategic, and meaningful. Mechanical choice refers to the functional options given to the player. For example, during the battle stage in a Pokemon game, the player has several possible actions they can take. They can fight, choose to swap out one Pokemon for another, use an item, or attempt to run. It's a player's ability to choose to turn left or right, move forwards or backwards, pick up or drop an item. It's the actions a player can enact in the virtual environment. Strategic choice leans more into something we'll discuss more shortly, the idea of intentionality. But as a basic explanation, again, with Pokemon, your decisions are often based on strategy. For instance, you might choose to use a water attack against a fire type because it's super effective. Or perhaps you're up against a Pokemon which is strong against your own, so you might tactically swap your Pokemon out for another. It's using the information you have to inform your decisions. And finally, meaningful choice. This is a shift from the notion of agency as representing choice or freedom to one of agency as representing commitment to meaning. A meaningful choice has permanent side effects that impact the world and the storyline moving forwards. For example, if I choose to kill a character for the sake of potentially saving another, I am going to impact the plot moving forwards for the rest of the game, or at least feel like I have. It's important for these meaningful choices to be clear, and the player needs to understand the actions they are taking. The reason this is so important is the aforementioned concept of intentionality. Intentionality is the idea of players again having control over their actions. Steve Lee breaks down intentionality into 4 elements: choice, motivation, information, and time. Choice basically refers to having mechanical choice, so the ability to choose which direction a character moves or what action they take at a given moment. Motivation is the player's goal, which in the case of Until Dawn and The Quarry is to keep your characters alive, at least in your first playthrough. Information gives the player reasoning behind their potential choices. For example, being offered to follow the direction of footsteps, generally you might understand that they are made by a person, or the game might provide hints through the use of clues or premonitions to better direct the player's actions. And finally, time. This is what allows you to plan your actions during a decision, a moment to digest the situation and think over your options, shotgun or chainsaw to amputate a hand. It's important that we have our designated mechanical choices, a clear motivation why we're making these choices, information to inform those choices, and time to think those choices over. These allow us to make a meaningful, intentionally driven decision within the game, and this supports a feeling of agency and control over the situation, which is integral to interactive narrative-based games. It feeds into immersing us into our decisions and building a feeling of flow within the gameplay. Though there are limitations. Game development is resource intensive. For every character that stays alive or chooses a different path from the others can lead into new voice lines, interactions, environments, and even more choices. It's important to sometimes limit a player's freedom whilst not breaking their feeling of agency. This is where the illusion of choice comes into play. This is the concept of an individual being led to believe that their decisions or actions in a given situation have meaning, when they perhaps do not. A fascinating example of this is in Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. The player is encouraged to bash the triangle button ever quicker to keep Snake alive through the microwave tunnel, but in actuality, so long as you press the button at a steady continual pace, the gameplay doesn't change, it's all an illusion. Both Until Dawn and The Quarry feature prologue sections where you play as either Beth or Laura. You are prompted and able to make several decisions in these opening scenes, but ultimately they have no impact. Beth and Hannah will always die, and Laura and Max will always be attacked and captured. What's interesting about the illusion of choice is that a study into the concept found that there were in most cases no significant differences in players' reported feelings of agency when they experienced a branching story versus a linear story. This suggests that the degree of actual choice isn't as important as the feeling of freedom to choose. We see this technique used throughout both Until Dawn and The Quarry, to varying levels of success. We'll definitely be going into more detail regarding that later in the video. The reason for the illusion of choice is ultimately, even in a choice-driven game, we are following a pre-written script, which requires specific beats to push the story forwards. Some moments and choices are carefully constructed to convince the player they're in control, when they are actually following the narrative structure. And this brings us to the idea of traditional narrative theory. This is the conventional path a story follows. Equilibrium. An initial state of balance, peace, or normality. For example, counsellors working at a summer camp getting ready to go home. Disruption of the equilibrium. Something disrupts the former state, such as Jacob breaking the car, followed by a full moon drawing forth dangerous monsters. Recognition of the disruption. When the characters become aware of the situation, be it the hunters in the woods or the beasts that hunt them all.
This isn't a ghost story, it's a creature feature. It's really happening and you're all in it.
An attempt to repair the damage. Characters will seek to restore balance by dealing with the former disruption in some manner, like killing the white wolf, which is the root cause of the curse that befalls them. New equilibrium. Finally, the ending, be it happy or not, a new equilibrium is established. For example, killing the white wolf or having your characters fall victim to it. What makes Until Dawn and The Quarry interesting is the evolution through this traditional theory, with twists and turns making the player question what is even going on, continually establishing new potential disruptions. Until Dawn, for example, can have you wondering if there are ghosts, a murderer, or monsters before the reveal of Josh's prank and the unforeseen Wendigos. The Quarry is perhaps less successful at disguising its twists and turns with its sometimes on-the-nose foreshadowing, but still makes attempts to have the player questioning who the hunters are, the ghostly Eliza, the creepy policeman, and ultimately the werewolf menace that befalls the campsite. What is integral to this is that we feel involved in the story itself. Often, you will find that, as a player, our degree of information is at the same level as the characters in the game. In Until Dawn, we know about as much as the other characters. We even see dialogue evolve based on the clues we have found. The same applies to The Quarry, outside of those who are able to see through the continuous full moon foreshadowing. What this achieves is that on top of a feeling of control over one's environment with intentional choice, players also feel connected to the characters and story, leading to a greater sense of immersion. Immersion, as we use the term here, is intended to mean the engagement or involvement a person feels as a result of playing a digital game. Immersion can be broken down into three categories: tactical, strategic, and narrative. Tactical immersion refers to becoming reactive to the stimuli. For instance, both games feature quick-time events, where players must promptly press the correct key to ensure a character's action is successful. It is highly engaging and requires the player to focus, especially when you don't know when you might be required to press a button at any point, encouraging the player to engage with what's happening on screen at all times. Strategic somewhat blurs into the idea of intentionality. This is what allows you to think about the decisions and actions you want to enact. If you are actively assessing why you are making an in-game choice, you are actively immersing yourself in the world. And finally, narrative. This is when a person becomes connected to a storyline or a set of characters. Often, this will leave a person more willing to overlook a lack of tactical or strategic immersion, but instead they may become keen to keep specific characters alive or encourage some romance between them. This has both pros and cons, which we'll explore more later on. But what's important is that as a player, we feel able to impact the narrative, so it is our deductions which lead to the recognition of what is happening. It is our intentional choice on how best to repair the situation that ultimately leads to a new equilibrium. It is our connection to the story and characters that immerse us as we puppeteer our protagonist through this dangerous virtual world. But how do you go about designing and creating a true interactive narrative experience? An interactive narrative is a time-based representation of character and action in which a reader can affect, choose, or change the plot. The first, second, or third person characters may actually be the reader. It is a story in which the audience is able to control and alter elements of the plot based on their inputs. Before we explore interactive narratives further, we should begin with the foundations of their design. How do you structure a story with this amount of player agency? You may have heard of decision trees before. These are hierarchical structures which direct outcomes based on choices, resources, and sometimes chance. Used in a variety of ways, but sometimes used in the design of games such as interactive narratives. It allows designers to map out how one choice might lead to several others. This can help identify the number of environments you might need, character interactions, and potentially lead you to remap things to bring characters back together. For instance, if we look at the decision tree of The Walking Dead Season 1, ultimately, even if you choose one of two opposing options, you will still be brought to a common singular point again. Be it if you choose to kill one character over another, both characters still might end up dead, or are somehow separated from the core narrative. This ensures that important moments of the overarching story can continue, and also limits the amount of new content that might need to be generated. The difficulty emerges from having a character remain as a possible key player of the storyline, whilst also being equally able to no longer participate within said plot. How do you keep the narrative flowing with and or without specific members of your cast? Until Dawn does this particularly well, with characters like Jessica and Matt, who can be killed fairly early or become separated from the group, but rather than feeling like background characters who survived, they actually had their own paths and can meet up as a separate branch. This works around the potential difficulty of having them be key players in the main plot, whilst not making them feel completely disconnected from the storyline itself. In The Quarry, there can be moments which leave characters feeling a little underdeveloped in certain situations. For example, Abigail becomes somewhat irrelevant to a pivotal conversational moment in the story, because at this point, she could have died just prior. You could suggest she was in shock given the situation, but it was noticeable enough how quiet she became in said moment, and the other characters don't really acknowledge her at this point either. But whether a character like Abigail survives or dies in this chapter, she can continue to have a meaningful impact on the story at large. This is achieved through something known as future narratives. Future narratives do not operate with events as their minimal units. Rather, their minimal unit is at least one situation that allows for more than one continuation. We call this a nodal situation, or a node for short. These nodes are what build up a branching narrative. One nodal situation might give several options and branch to several new separate nodes. A situation is nodal if it allows for more than one continuation, which means that the two continuations that are both possible from one point have to be different from each other. So one example could be Abigail surviving the aforementioned interaction with Nick when he transforms. Choosing whether or not to shoot the shotgun has two possible continuations. Abigail survives or dies. And what makes these nodes so important in games like The Quarry and Until Dawn is they can alter the future of the game. If a character dies, they might miss out on an opportunity to interact and save another character later on. Each pivotal nodal situation can completely change your playthrough from someone else's. This again all leads into the idea of meaningful choice. There are three main types of interactive narratives. Firstly, there is nodal, which is a little different from the future narratives idea of nodal, which we just discussed. Nodal refers to a series of non-interactive events interrupted by points of interactivity. The player cannot change the direction of the overall plot, but can change its pace. For example, if you make the wrong decision, you might have to go back and redo a portion of the game until you choose the correct path. Then there is modulated. Player action chooses which path the plot will follow, by choosing from finite sets of predefined options at fixed decision points in the plot. This is the most similar to the games we're discussing today. It gives the player a degree of agency, allowing them to shape the direction of the story to some extent with a limited amount of options. This is the idea of one node splitting into several others, future narratives. For instance, choosing to amputate Dylan's hand or not, both of these options change upcoming potential events. And finally, open. The most expressive for the player, far less so for the designer. The story is usually based on the development of character or the development of environment, or both. The idea here is the game is a lot more open to interpretation and relies on the player to express themselves and find meaning in the world on their own by leveling up or building a home or some other creative outlet. Until Dawn and The Quarry are both modulated and utilise future narrative systems to give the player an interactive experience. There is not only a structure that needs to be considered for how a decision impacts the narrative though, but also the architecture of the narrative itself. Jenkins suggests there are 4 models that must be drawn from to develop the architecture of any narrative. These are evocative spaces. These rely on the player's pre-existing knowledge of the genre or world, which allows them to fill in any blanks without the narrative needing to explicitly explain everything. An example could be watching a Star Wars film. Newer sequels might assume you understand who Darth Vader is/was. Enacted narratives. This is when a player develops their character over time through story quests or leveling up. These are very much focused on the idea of character growth. An MMO, for example, might have your character's lore somewhat build up around their increasing strength and sense of progression. Embedded narratives. These are predetermined stories where players follow along the creator's narrative and the player simply follows along. And emergent narratives. Players follow the rules and structure of the game, but decisions by the player can change the direction of the game's narrative. For example, The Sims. The storyline is how you choose to play within the confines of the game's set of rules, such as what job you get, or getting married, etc. It's worth noting that video games often use a combination of these models. To some extent, you could suggest both Until Dawn and The Quarry use all of them to some degree. Evocative narrative elements leave the player able to use their existing knowledge of horror to try to connect the dots and piece together the story. Players can enact the development of characters and shift how they feel about one another at times. There are larger decisions that players can make, which can lead to emergent style plots where entire segments of the game can change based on a player's input. And finally, there is an embedded structure, which keeps the game plot cohesive, but with enough emergent elements and illusion of choice to convince a player that they are in control of the entire story. So that gives a rough explanation for how one might map out and shape an interactive story. Video games provide such a versatile amount of control to their designers. But what separates out video games so much more from a simple sequence to follow along is that we literally hold the controls in our hands. Let's explore how it feels to put forward our actions within these choice-driven games. Narratology tells us that people learn through taking in, reconstructing, and acting out or telling stories. Ludology tells us that people interact with reality or representational experience with or without a narrative structure. What this means is that narratology is very separate from the study of games. Narratology is the study of narratives themselves and their structures. Ludology is the study of games, the act of playing them, and the culture surrounding them. There is no doubt that both games have a great deal of interesting narrative related areas we could continue to discuss, and we will to some extent throughout this video. But I want to focus on the games themselves a bit right now. Something I think is often overlooked when discussing video games is their actual control systems, and Until Dawn is a particularly interesting example. Until Dawn was initially being developed as a first-person game for the PlayStation 3, and would use the PlayStation Move controller, but somewhere during its development, this changed. It became a PlayStation 4 game, and instead utilised much of the PS4 controller's capabilities. Interactive narrative games often rely on something known as quick-time events. These are moments in a game that rely on a player to react swiftly with specific inputs. What's interesting about these moments and interactions is how they promote a player's focus and thus immersion. In Until Dawn, or The Quarry, if you stop focusing for just a moment, You might alter your playthrough and unknowingly make a choice by missing a QTE. By encouraging an intense focus throughout the game, this encourages a feeling of flow. Flow tends to occur when a person faces a clear set of goals that require appropriate responses. I went into a lot more detail regarding game flow in my Bloodborne video, but just to summarise it here, it is the balance between challenge and skill. It's keeping a game in a state of not being too difficult nor too easy, to avoid a feeling of frustration or boredom. This is increasingly difficult when the gameplay mostly comes down to making set decisions. But by encouraging a player to want to remain focused on every moment, the challenge becomes the player remaining engaged. When a surprise QTE prompt appears and you, the player, hit it, it feels great and you are rewarded for your focus. But again, if you're already narratively immersed and your reaction times are strong, then the game needs to rely on variety to keep the player challenged. Until Dawn does this by using the aforementioned capabilities of the PlayStation 4 controller, namely motion tracking. One of the most memorable and challenging QTEs present in Until Dawn are that of the "don't move" variety. This is where the player is prompted not to move the controller at all. It is an incredibly tense event, and usually success or failure will result in the life or death for the on-screen character. The controller can be quite sensitive, so you often find yourself holding your breath, going silent, and staying as still as possible, much like the in-game character. Why I think this is so incredible is the game has a controller prompt which manages to encourage the player to mimic the behaviours of the in-game character. This is a fascinating way to attempt to immerse and connect a player to an in-game moment. Though I will say, sometimes the controller could be overly sensitive, which could feel a little frustrating. This principle of connecting the player's inputs to that of the characters is also used on simpler actions. Picking up items to inspect them asks the player to turn the item using a corresponding motion of the controller's toggle. Another instance is when grasping a door handle and pulling it towards you. The control scheme is actually employed incredibly well to connect the player's mind to the in-game action by using the toggle to mimic the on-screen action itself. Now let's compare this to The Quarry. The Quarry was not exclusive to a particular system, and thus its inputs needed to be much more universal, working on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox systems alike. It's worth noting that Sony Entertainment likely specifically wanted Until Dawn to work with their PS4 controllers to really show off their potential. Unlike The Quarry, extra funding was likely poured into Until Dawn for that purpose. Anyway, The Quarry also uses QuickTime events throughout, but they can function a little differently in some situations. Both games feature single button actions during high octane moments, but in The Quarry, they also use directional movement. So in some cases, the player must instead press the correct directional key or move the controller toggle stick in the correct direction. This movement will then reflect the character's actions on screen. Much like Until Dawn, with features such as examining items or opening doors, this encourages the player's inputs to mimic the actions on screen, encouraging that sense of immersion. The Quarry's QTEs also give you a bit more time to digest the information. The player is granted a couple of seconds to prepare themselves, which on the one hand, it is more likely that they will be able to act with intention, but the downside is the challenge is heavily reduced because the level of focus is lowered, which might harm their feeling of flow. Until Dawn, in contrast, can be quite intense with a split second to react. The Quarry is a lot more forgiving in its QTEs. Picking items up is also simplified in The Quarry. Rather than needing to turn an object to inspect it, the character does a lot more of the work. You simply press the interact button and the on-screen character will do the rest of the work for you. The same applies to simple tasks like opening doors. The player needs only to press the interaction button and the on-screen character will do the rest in a cutscene. It's a little unfortunate that they simplified these moments. Although a small detail, it does reduce the player's sense of involvement. The don't move concept is also simplified, using a red haze on the screen to represent it being dangerous to move. It's very easy to overcome these moments, so although tense, it lacks the same immersive feel as Again, it's just waiting for the right moment to press the interact button. Again, The Quarry needed to function universally on various platforms, but we can compare it to an alternative system the same developers have used in the Dark Pictures anthology. This being the heartbeat system. Players must time their button inputs with the beats of the character's heart to ensure they remain calm and hidden. It's a fairly intense mechanic, which again encourages focus. In The Quarry, the red haze alternative just feels like the least challenging way to implement this concept, which I again would suggest reduces that feeling of challenge and thus damages a sense of flow. Generally, I would suggest both games do a good job of using quick-time events to involve the player. The use of directional movements in the player's actions furthers this feeling and adds to the player's immersion. Until Dawn excels at this, especially when interacting with objects. Also, with the PS4 controller's integration, particularly with the Don't Move sequence, compels the player to fully reenact the actions of the on-screen character, as they try not to be caught by their pursuers. In contrast, The Quarry has opted to reduce the level of involvement and intensity with its QTEs, which I would suggest has limited how connected a player can feel to the on-screen action, either by having them feel more like a passive bystander as characters open doors, or when intense moments feel so overly simplified it feels like it's just one small step above a cutscene. But game controls and player inputs are only one way the player connects to the on-screen action, so let's explore how else you might encourage players to invest in your world. In constructing a story where agency is linked primarily to the survival of the protagonists, it is integral that an audience can relate and emotionally connect to the cast of characters. Narrative immersion is going to need to be achieved, and horror is an especially powerful genre to accomplish this within. In 1919, Sigmund Freud described and defined the concept of the uncanny. This describes how something familiar can be contorted to become unnerving to a person. For example, Michael Myers in the film Halloween. He is humanoid, but devoid of emotion, static in the way he stands and stares, stalking his prey. He's recognisable as a human figure, but between his pose and his mask, there's something not quite right about him. Another slightly different example could be in the movie Psycho. A motherly figure is something we often prescribe to be a nurturing, kind figure, but in Psycho, the mother is morphed into an evil form in the main character's subconscious mind. Again, we recognise the concept, but it's not quite right. This concept of the uncanny is prevalent throughout both Until Dawn and The Quarry. For instance, in Until Dawn, the man with the flamethrower acts not dissimilar to Michael Myers early on. His eyes are hidden, his communication is muted, his body is mostly static, his behaviour is uncanny to that of a normal person trying to help. The bizarre jump scares Josh has set up across the mountain continue to add to this uncanny atmosphere, which feels so disjointed from the theme of death plaguing our cast. And then there is the Wendigos themselves. Their movement is one of the most iconic elements of the game, akin to that of old stop motion movies. It's not quite natural and is somewhat haunting to behold. The same applies to The Quarry. Travis, for example, the police officer in the opening prologue. His behaviour is so strange, the way he licks the pencil, his eye movements. Nothing about his interactions feels normal, even though nothing is overtly abnormal. Or honestly, my favourite example of the uncanny from the game is when the game highlights a character's face during a dialogue choice. When under the microscope, something doesn't feel quite right when you stare at the computer-generated faces. Obviously it's all human, it's remarkably detailed, but there is something off-putting in the smiles, the eyes. But why might an audience enjoy this idea of the uncanny so much? One reason could be the concept of catharsis, a concept described by Aristotle. It's the concept that by viewing violent or frightening scenes in movies, we are able to purge our negative emotions by confronting them. Perhaps by witnessing these uncanny and creepy figures be shown to be friendly or defeated by our heroes, the audience receives a positive resolution. Though, it is worth noting there isn't a great deal of data to support this theory actually impacts an audience's emotional state at all, but the theory is still interesting. But despite the catharsis theory itself not having a great deal of supportive data, there is an extension of it, known as the excitation transfer theory, coined by Dr. Dolph Zillman in 1983. Negative feelings created by horror movies actually intensify the positive feelings when the hero triumphs in the end. And even some small studies have shown that people's enjoyment was actually higher during the scary parts of a movie than it was after. Though again, data is inconclusive on this theory, and the link to enjoyment and intense, scary sections of a film could be only one of many reasons we enjoy horror as a genre. Another paper, this time on the topic of why horror is so seductive to an audience, suggests, we are attracted to horrifying entertainment because we have an adaptive tendency to find pleasure in make-believe that allows us to experience negative emotions at high levels of intensity within a safe context. So potentially, we, as an audience, enjoy engaging in horror media because of the catharsis that comes from confronting the uncanny. But isn't it somewhat sadistic to enjoy watching other characters in these terrifying situations? This leads us to the dispositional alignment theory. It is hypothesized that a person's emotional reactions to events portrayed in a horror film can be traced back to the dispositional feelings they have for the person involved. Essentially, we enjoy watching bad things occur to characters which we feel deserve it, and in contrast, enjoy rooting for a character who we feel deserves to survive or that we simply like. This is partially what makes interactive stories like Until Dawn and The Quarry so interesting. We might not only connect both positively and negatively to specific characters, but their fates are in our hands. It is our agency that will determine their outcome in the story, and I would suggest it is that connection that so strongly invokes narrative immersion. But it is not enough for us to simply have control over these characters' fates. We also need to believe they are in peril in some manner. The world needs to convince us there is danger. How does a developer help immerse their player into the game world? Research suggests games have a far easier time immersing their audiences when in a first-person perspective, regardless of what kind of camera they prefer. Interactive narratives, traditionally, are from a third-person perspective, as you watch over the characters, not dissimilar to that of a movie. Both Until Dawn and The Quarry primarily use third-person cameras, but they also occasionally use a first-person camera as well. In Until Dawn, you find yourself interviewed by a mysterious therapist named Dr. Hill, whilst in first person. As your meetings with him progress, you explore which characters you like over others, you discuss fears which eventually warp the environment. It's a very surreal experience, before slowly it is unveiled that you are actually within the mind of Josh. But these transitional scenes do an incredible job of immersing you in the role of puppet master, with well-crafted dialogue giving the illusion of breaking the fourth wall, and directly speaking to us, the player. A similar approach is used in The Quarry, where you meet the fortune teller named Eliza between chapters. Handing her tarot cards, which can be found within the game chapters, she unveils potential hints of what is to come, although I could rarely make any sense of them. She gives some disposition here and there, but in this case, she appears to be speaking to us directly, as in the player. There is no twist that we're secretly a character in the game this time. In these scenes, the player is positioned in a first-person perspective, and immersed in the role of puppet master, much like in Until Dawn. You could even argue more so, as this character's face is never revealed, allowing you to fully imprint upon them as yourself. Both games do a great job of managing to place us, the player's perspective, into the game world, blurring that line of watching a movie and being the puppeteer using a limited but effective amount of first person. As a result, increasing our connection to the protagonist's plight, and depending on whether we like them or not as a character, we might enjoy watching them suffer or survive the horror-driven gameplay. The next challenge is to build a plausible world which the player can find believable. Todorov, in 1973, broke down the genre of horror into three main categories, these being uncanny, which we have already explored in some detail prior, but to summarise again, something recognisable feeling wrong. Then there is the marvellous. This is the introduction of the supernatural, something that exists outside of the bounds of what we know to be true, such as ghosts. And fantastic. This is the concept of us having to question reality. Something might seem marvellous, but we're left to ponder if it is truly supernatural, or merely an illusion. The example Todorov uses is of Alvaro, from Jacques Cosette's Le Diable Amoureux. The character of Alvaro must decide whether the woman he loves is truly mortal or is the devil. In Until Dawn, this might be when you begin to see ghosts haunting the cabin before finding the hidden camera. Suddenly, you're in this fantastical state of questioning what is real.
Go suck an egg.
We discussed prior how uncanny is utilised within both games to give this sense of something not feeling quite right, but in both cases, a more supernatural element is introduced. Until Dawn with the Wendigos, and The Quarry with the werewolves. Big, scary, hairy werewolves. Sure. Anyway, it's integral to introduce these marvellous concepts in a believable way, to not disrupt the immersion and connection to the narrative the game needs the player to have. To achieve this, Until Dawn effectively breadcrumbs the tragic story of the miners with Native American iconography throughout, whilst adding layers of Josh's prank to misdirect the player. This leaves the player in a sort of detective role, trying to make sense of the information fed to them. The genius of this, in terms of the game design, is I would suggest it furthers the narrative immersion. The player becomes increasingly invested in discovering the truth, and will, as a result, be more forgiving of other forms of immersion because they are now invested in the world itself. The Quarry has a similar structure, though there is certainly less detective work to be done. The main focus is the mystery that surrounds Chris Hackett and his family. Again, it's pretty on the nose of its werewolf referencing from the very beginning, so personally, I was less invested in the mystery itself. For example, being generous, by the time Laura returns and is explaining what's happening to the other characters, werewolves etc., we, the audience, already kind of know. We're a step ahead of the protagonists, leaving us, the player, to be a little disjointed from their thought processes. Which I would suggest is potentially why narrative immersion is less effective in this case. We can relate to the characters less. What I am suggesting is to ensure narrative immersion is strong within a player, it is integral that players and in-game characters alike are mostly on the same page, not waiting for one side to catch up. They need to be equally affected by twists, turns and plot reveals. I would argue Until Dawn achieves this almost perfectly, whereas The Quarry is almost too keen to foreshadow its reveal early on, and reveal its supernatural antagonist too early. Consider how long it is before we see a full Wendigo versus a full werewolf. In The Quarry, a werewolf attacks Abigail and Nick in Chapter 3, where, although at night and quite dark, it's fully visible. Whereas in Until Dawn, we don't see a full Wendigo with all of its limbs until Chapter 8, as one hunts Emily through the tunnels. They are alluded to, we see parts of, but never its full body earlier to this point. My point is, Until Dawn better connects the player to its narrative through the use of mystery because you become eager to figure out what is actually happening. The Quarry is a character game. The focus is never really on you solving the mystery, but instead the characters themselves. So to summarise, both games use similar techniques to connect players to their world. The characters are a focus and their personalities flow into the dispositional alignment theory, making an audience seek to see favourable characters survive and less favourable perish. First-person cameras are used to further immerse the player within the puppeteer role in between chapters. But Until Dawn relies on a greater sense of mystery and better paces the use of its supernatural antagonist. I would suggest this increases the player's investment in the narrative and thus a greater sense of immersion. The Quarry is perhaps too eager to show its cards, and thus the player is less invested, as in my case, was a step ahead of the on-screen characters, disconnecting me from their mindset. And with that, I think it's time for us to directly start comparing Until Dawn and The Quarry in a bit more detail. As we've just mentioned the dispositional alignment theory, let's discuss the characters themselves. For this chapter, I'm going to focus on the playable characters. Let's start with Until Dawn. I will skip over Hannah and Beth though, as we've already discussed their part in the story to some extent. But with Until Dawn, we begin our story at the foot of the snowy Blackwood Mountains, and we are introduced to our first character, Sam, Hannah's best friend, and a moderately passive character in terms of involvement with the infamous prank. A recognisable face played by Hayden Panettiere, a kind of pseudo-lead character for the game. She is not only the first character we play after the prologue, but she will be the last as well, with plot armour so impressive it almost overtakes her ability to wear a towel. Sam is a skilled climber, level-headed in a stressful situation, and a loyal friend. While she finds her way to the cable car, we meet Chris, portrayed by Noah Fleiss, a humorous character who has a crush on another character named Ashley.
Bitch.
This romantic interest immediately makes Chris a more relatable character for the player, and we all enjoy rooting for a love story. An extra detail along with the banter between Sam and Chris is the story of how Chris met his best friend, Josh. There are layers of development to establish genuine friendship. We are then also introduced to Emily, played by Nicole Bloom, and Matt, portrayed by Jordan Fisher. Emily is Mike's ex-girlfriend, intelligent and perhaps a little selfish at times. She oozes girl boss energy and in my opinion is the best character in the game.
At least I can think. 4.0 bitch, on a roll.
She can come across rather demanding of Matt, her new boyfriend, and she can be one of the more polarizing characters. She displays more of the negative traits we hope not to relate to, but know all too well, including jealousy and selfishness. But she has a complex set of emotions. We see her vulnerable and scared, with moments of bravery and strength. She's interesting because although unlikable at times, she reveals more of herself as the game progresses, and due to that, I couldn't help but root for her. Then there is Matt. Again, he displays relatable but unlikable traits of a somewhat weak, jealous yes man under Emily's thumb. I would say Matt is one of the criminally less developed characters, partially because he is somewhat overshadowed by Emily, in combination with being a difficult character to keep alive, though can later show strength and bravery if he makes it that far. Matt's jealousy is something which can be fueled by another polarizing character, in Ashley, depicted by Galadriel Steinman. Chris has a crush on her, and likewise, she reciprocates those feelings as well, though neither have told the other. A charming will they won't they love story. What's great about Ashley is she comes across fairly innocent, but with time, she is maybe the only character that develops to show more negative traits, such as selfishness.
Okay, oh my god, will you just go? Go, get out of here!
Lying.
Do it, Chris. It should be me. You chose to save me
Oh,
before.
fuck.
Let me choose this time. Let me choose to save you.
And treachery.
Ash! What are you doing?
She is the only character who you could argue is culpable in the death of another directly, shockingly, that being her love interest, Chris. Once Sam and Chris ascend the cable car, we meet Jessica, played by Megan Martin, Mike's new girlfriend. She comes across as a confident, somewhat fiery character, though later we can hear of her more vulnerable side. She is one of the key instigators of the initial prank that led to Hannah and Beth's disappearance as well. What's great about this is even if you haven't warmed up to her during her spicy argument with Emily,
You couldn't buy a moldy loaf of bread with your skanky ass.
Are you serious? Do you think that's insulting?
That bitch is on crack or something.
when she shows a more vulnerable side of herself to Mike, we again can relate to her. Much like Chris, she can quickly become far more relatable, and if the player makes the right choices, her survival is one of the more satisfying, as she has one of the most difficult journeys. She is dating Mike, portrayed by Brett Dalton. Similar to Sam, he is a somewhat pseudo-lead character who has divine plot armor, keeping him safe until the very end of the game. He is Emily's ex and quickly shows a lot of carefree, juvenile traits, but develops into a brave leader who spearheads rescue missions to save his friends despite the dangers. His somewhat sleazy introduction during the prologue is over time repaired by his protective nature. The final character is the brother of the missing Hannah and Beth, Josh, another particularly recognisable face in Rami Malek. Josh is a complex character who on the one hand we feel sympathy for as he clearly tries to put on a brave face given the situation, but displays some sleazy traits of his own when talking to Chris about Ashley. We eventually learn of his mental health difficulties and how he planned this elaborate and excellently done prank on his friends in a sort of revenge plot. Faking his own death at one point, he maybe went a bit too far. But Josh is a tragic character, and one who perhaps unintentionally you are kept on the fence about in the early portions of the game. Until Dawn does a particularly good job of introducing a group of characters which initially leave you with a bad taste in your mouth with their immature, rude, and mean-spirited prank. This leads into the dispositional alignment theory. We are somewhat set up to believe the characters deserve an ill fate to befall them. But over time, and even early on, the game begins to show us redeemable and likeable elements to each character, evolving how we feel and perhaps adapting our choices. The characters themselves and the relationships with one another are at the forefront of the early stages of the game, and it's fascinating to reflect on the development they show when forced into difficult situations. Much like how we might root for the final girl in a traditional slasher film, it's difficult to not find yourself doing the same for most of the cast in Until Dawn. There are a variety of personality traits between the characters, which leads to drama and confrontations, and each character feels unique and believable. Josh's descent after his prank meets its conclusion is a little jarring at first, but also understandable, as keeping up the act was perhaps all that was keeping him focused from the trauma of losing his sisters. And Matt is a little underdeveloped, but with 8 total characters to flesh out, I can be a little forgiving of that. Each character is excellently performed with outstanding voice work throughout, especially moments like Ashley's reaction to Josh's death.
No!
You gotta go, okay?
And some particularly fun moments from Josh himself.
Well, can't tie them up if they just wiggle around.
Gosh, dude!
Leave me a little wiggle room, huh?
So now we have a baseline of Until Dawn's cast, let's discuss The Quarry. For this, I'll be focusing on the main group of playable characters again, like I did with Until Dawn, but don't worry, some of the other characters will be discussed later on, But anyway, like with Until Dawn, we begin a prologue with Laura and Max, played by Siobhan Williams and Skylar Gisondo. They're quite the adorable pair on their way to Hackett's Quarry a day early. We find that Laura is a resourceful and intelligent character with how she is able to trick the creepy Officer Travis into pointing out the location of the campsite, accompanied by Max, her sarcastic and charming sidekick. As the game progresses, we learn more about these characters, and Laura evolves into a total badass, eye patch and all, focused on saving her boyfriend Max. Max himself, now cursed with lycanthropy, is keen to keep her safe, but understandably eager to be free of the curse as well. They clearly have a strong bond, which you can't help but warm to. Let's fast forward. Summer camp has just ended. We see our characters waving goodbye with particularly optimistic music playing in the background. It is here we're first introduced to Jacob, the embodiment of a lovable idiot, portrayed by Zach Tinker. He's had a summer fling with another character named Emma, and isn't taking its end particularly well. He's not giving up on her though, and in his immaturity sabotages the car, trapping him and his friends in Hackett's Quarry for one more eventful night. Although juvenile, again, like Laura and Max, is incredibly likeable, and his somewhat immature behaviour is quite unchanging through the course of the story.
Pop, pop, peanut butter pops. Pop, pop, pop them in your mouth. Pop.
At one point, he storms off and cries after Emma kisses Nick and stumbles through the forest walking into traps. He's quite foolish, and you can't help but like him throughout, even if he is a little infuriatingly childish sometimes.
With like a rifle, okay, not with this freaking cannon blaster.
That is how you get someone shot.
Nah, it's okay. You probably would have missed me anyway. Hey!
Okay, disqualified for being a dumbass.
No!
Emma, portrayed by Halston Sage, is an online influencer who is confident, intelligent, and determined. She has just broken up with Jacob, which was a pre-agreed situation of a summer camp fling. She comes across a little cold about the situation though, and goes as far as to twist the knife by kissing Nick during the beach party. She also insults Jacob at every opportunity to make him feel small.
How am I just noticing how super lame you are?
What?
And kind of continues to lead him on throughout the game. She's fairly unlikable in this regard, and doesn't really get the opportunity to grow or develop throughout the story. Speaking of Nick, he's an Australian camp counsellor, played by Evan Evagora. He, and another character called Abigail, portrayed by Ariel Winters, have a budding romance, not dissimilar to Until Dawn with Chris and Ashley. Both come across as quite sweet to each other, and it's always hard not to root for romance in these situations. Unfortunately, Nick becomes increasingly aggressive after an unfortunate encounter with a werewolf, before ultimately fleeing the situation and becoming a background antagonist. Abigail is a fairly timid character throughout, but does show some elements of bravery later on to help her friends if the right choices are made. She comes across as a very sweet and innocent figure in the game, especially when paired up with Emma. Caitlin, another character, this time portrayed by Brenda Song, is a strong, assertive character who is a bit of a badass with a shotgun. She shows a great deal of confidence and maturity. She knows how cars work, she's level-headed, and gives off a strong aura of leadership, but submits that role to another character in Ryan for some reason.
That shotgun's got a hell of a spread. Be careful.
Why? You're the most experienced shooter. Why? Ryan, played by Justin Smith, is arguably our pseudo-lead character in this game, as he does kind of lead the cast along with Laura upon her return. He is a quiet but responsible figure who loves being alone and listening to podcasts about the paranormal.
The Hag of Hackett's Quarry.
The who of the what's it where now?
Quite reserved, he's a fairly neutral character at first, but his interactions with other characters do warm you to him as the story progresses, especially with Dylan. Dylan, depicted by Miles Robbins, is a sarcastic, laid-back figure with an affection for music and secretly quantum physics. He eventually reveals how his blasé persona is to cover up his less confident side, and it's a nice development that makes the player able to relate to him. It's one of the few examples of a character opening up in The Quarry, and in describing these characters from each game, I can't help but notice a difference. So let's discuss the concept of character development. There are two character describers I think might help explain my perspective. These are round characters and flat characters. Round refers to a character with a complex personality, with plenty of depth to their emotions, which can adapt and evolve throughout a story. They are able to exhibit an arc. For example, Mike is a fairly laid-back, passive figure, avoiding conflict, playing pranks, and just wanting to have a good time.
Jesus!
but we see him rapidly adapt into a more heroic role. Firstly, chasing after Jessica to save her in a blind panic, but later on taking charge in the cabin and putting himself in a dangerous situation to get the cable keys and save Josh, fighting through countless Wendigos to do this. He becomes a brave leader figure. Flat characters, however, remain the same throughout any situation, showing no substantial changes to who they are. I would unfortunately suggest the Quarry's cast are a lot more flat. They are, for the most part, at least initially, a much more likeable bunch, but perhaps this leaves them little room to become more so. Outside of Laura, who evolves into a one-eyed badass, mostly the characters remain static in personality, and even Laura's arc mostly takes place off-screen. How does Ryan change as a character? Does Jacob learn some maturity? Does Emma reflect on her somewhat cruel behaviours at all? No, they all basically end the night as they began, if they're not dead that is. So, I would suggest the Quarry's characters are a lot more difficult to invest in, which is a shame, because this can strengthen the narrative immersion we discussed earlier. For me, it makes sense that Dylan is so popular among the characters, because he shows some development when he opens up to Ryan. Both games are excellently acted and superbly voiced. The characters are all likeable in their own ways. But, I would suggest that Until Dawn does a much more effective job of giving the characters room to grow, improve, and change how the audience perceives them. They begin the evening almost deserving some form of punishment after their prank, but can end the night as a stronger, better version of themselves, even Ashley to some extent.
No. Live and learn!
In The Quarry, outside of maybe Emma, they all begin somewhat likeable, and that doesn't really change. Ultimately, I would argue character development increases narrative immersion, and better leans into the idea of the dispositional alignment theory, making us feel more attached to the decisions which will ultimately determine our characters' fates. So point Until Dawn. Earlier, we discussed the use of a first-person camera during intermission-like segments between chapters. During these, we are confronted by two other characters I would like to discuss now in a bit more detail. They are somewhat omnipotent figures who help direct the story and player to some extent. With Until Dawn, we meet Dr. Hill, and in The Quarry, Eliza, the fortune teller. Let's start with Dr. Hill. He explores the player's feelings, their fears, their affection towards other characters, and eventually pushes the player to question their reality. I also want to say Peter Storman does an amazing job with the delivery and cadence with this performance. When he scolds the player and questions them, it is just so powerful.
What the hell have you done to them? Psychopath. Psychopath!
And his uncanny lip movements and mannerisms really add to each scene. The script itself is beautifully crafted to not allude to the player what is really happening, whilst also telling the player exactly what is going on, making the light bulb moment of connecting the dots that much more satisfying, especially during repeat playthroughs. For example,
I'm trying to help you. And this game you're playing, you understand that it's not good for you. It's not good for anyone. And I can't say that you're being particularly honest in the way you're playing.
It blurs the line. At this point, it feels as though he is breaking the fourth wall and is directly addressing us, the player. But eventually, we find that we are in the perspective of Josh, and the game refers to the prank he has set up for his friend group. There are lots of nice touches throughout as well, with certain choices, such as fears, directly impacting later scenes with Dr. Hill, and a particularly nice addition was the scratched out eyes of whomever you chose to be your least favourite character. We'll discuss more about the twists and turns of Until Dawn in the next chapter, but the reveal of the then interviewed player being the psychopath character perfectly ramps up the tension and intrigue of the ongoing story. Dr. Hill is, for me, what makes Until Dawn so unique compared to other interactive narratives at the time, and it's no wonder that the recipe was continued in the Dark Pictures anthology with the Curator, and in The Quarry, Eliza. Speaking of, Eliza Vorez, excellently portrayed by Grace Zabriskie, also known as the Hag of Hackett's Quarry,
The who of the what's it where now?
is the character who haunts Laura in the opening prologue. After which, she introduces the premise of the game and the concept of tarot cards in the first chapter intermission. These tarot cards are hidden throughout the world, and if found, can be handed to Eliza during these intermission stages. Players can then request one be used to show a mostly useless vision of the future, which impacted absolutely none of my decisions in the game. What was that? Much like Dr. Hill, her mouth movements can be quite unnerving at times, and her gaze can be a little intimidating, which fits well with her character. It really helps to build the atmosphere, especially with the camera's shaky movements. In these scenes, she does appear to be breaking the fourth wall, and speaks directly to us, the player. We are indeed pulling the strings of fate, and she is directing us to hopefully make the decisions to save her son Silas. She is directly part of the story, with a desire for vengeance against the Hackett family. On the one hand, this is potentially more immersive for us the player, as we are directly involved throughout, but I would suggest by the time Until Dawn reveals it was Josh in Dr. Hill's seat, we are equally already invested and immersed. Unfortunately though, I don't feel like these moments with Eliza have any major impact on the game. There's nothing particularly memorable about them outside of the performance. As I stated prior, none of the tarot cards really helped me in my playthrough, and her words add limited depth to the story. There's no reveal or lightbulb moment from her conversations. I would suggest these scenes feel more like a desire to retain the same structure as other Supermassive games, more so than adding much to the gameplay itself. That's not to say they are an unenjoyable addition to the overall game, only that with Until Dawn, the interactions feel important and impactful to how we perceive the gameplay ahead, whereas Eliza has little to no impact outside of a difficult to decipher fortune. So in this case, I would have to give Until Dawn another point. We're next going to discuss two concepts, foreboding and foreshadowing. Foreboding is a feeling that something very bad is going to happen soon. Horror media often uses the idea of foreboding imagery to build suspense and anticipation for what is to come, and both of the games we're discussing today are no different. Until Dawn is littered with unnerving moments. For example, the ominous character following our protagonists, also known as the flamethrower guy, who we've briefly discussed earlier in the video. He appears several times, ominously tracking our cast. Once in the prologue, he is spotted lurking outside the cabin. Again, when Sam first exits the bus, this time gripping a machete. Later again, using the cable cart shortly after Jess and Mike leave the area, and again, hauntingly standing behind Mike when Jess falls into the mines. Each time, his face is hidden, making it difficult for the audience to discern his intent, but everything about his presence seems malicious. He oozes that uncanny feeling we explored earlier. He gives off a foreboding aura. Of course, we later find that he is hunting the Wendigos, which begs the question, why didn't he just speak up sooner? But either way, he is the first of many foreboding elements. Flamethrower Guy's presence coincides with segments of Josh's prank. For instance, the wanted poster mentioning the fugitive, another foreboding element which in combination begins allowing the player to start connecting dots. And as the player begins trying to connect those dots, unknowingly, they have been narratively immersed into the game. They're now playing detective. But what is so well done in Until Dawn is as soon as you begin connecting those dots, a terrifying screech is heard from a distance, an unseen, unknown sound. We, the audience, are again left with questions. What only adds to this sense of confusion are elements such as the first-person perspectives from the creature, an unrecognisable point of view we get from time to time, watching and stalking our characters. And as the game progresses, we get more and more glimpses and interactions with these creatures, which we'll detail a little bit more in the next chapter. But before long, we're treated to another foreboding branch. Ghosts? During the Ouija board scene, a figure is visible in the background, along with the unnerving communication with Josh's sister. And just when you're beginning to digest this, the psychopath emerges. After being introduced as a threat to Josh, Ashley and Chris, we get elements of him watching Sam on the monitor, again, building tension and giving the player even more questions about what is even going on. And that's not even all yet. We also have the background narrative of the missing miners, which keeps being hinted at, and the Native American iconography as well. There's so many layers, and it all feels important, but we're just not sure how it all interlinks until later in the game. It's beautifully crafted and keeps the player in a state of wanting to figure out the mystery. And once everything is unveiled, suddenly it all makes sense. especially on a second playthrough. Little details like the brief but clear bathroom camera spotted in the cable cart control room, lights in the basement being on, and even small details like the missing axe. Similarly, The Quarry utilises moments of foreboding to build tension in the early stages of the game. Probably one of the best examples I've seen of this in any horror media is that of Ted Raimi's portrayal of Travis Hackett, the police officer. Almost every element of his interaction in the early prologue tells the player not to trust him. The lighting keeps much of his face in darkness, and is often not dissimilar to the way one would hold a flashlight when telling a scary story at a campsite. His facial expressions and the delivery of each line is filled with distrust and almost disdain towards our characters. The accompanying music and audio cues build this foreboding atmosphere to the point where you don't feel safe when Laura is requested to join him outside of the vehicle. And as if it all wasn't enough already, the way he wets the lead of the pencil is just so perfect that when Laura is finally safely back in the car, you can't help but feel some relief. Much like Until Dawn, first-person perspectives add to the tension here as well, with a slight animalistic growl from the creature in the prologue, or the threatening rifle scope watching our counsellors, followed by the reveal of two unknown hunters who then go on to cover themselves in blood, spurring questions and intrigue. The sign stating "hunting season" leaves you to wonder who or what is being hunted. More foreboding intrigue is added with the Hag of Hackett's Quarry, a ghostly voice speaking to Dylan down the phone before the line goes dead. It's adding layers to keep the player invested in the plot. Again, narrative immersion being the goal. We want the player to be invested in the story, and the more mystery that the audience is keen to uncover, the greater their investment. What both games are attempting to do is keep the player guessing with foreboding elements before eventually unleashing the true horror. But another tool which can be quite effective is that of foreshadowing. Foreshadowing implicitly alludes to a future event in a manner that makes it difficult for the reader to recognise its meaning until the event actually happens. It's a way to provide meaning to moments which may seem ordinary but are actually warning the audience of things to come. For example, in Until Dawn, there is a great moment where Sam tells Chris and Ashley to
But watch out for that Josh. He's a schemer.
Okay.
which in this moment, it's light-hearted, but a moment of foreshadowing because he is scheming the entire time, and the Ouija board is part of that scheme. I think Until Dawn does a great job of keeping these foreshadowing moments mild, and only in retrospect do you often see their meaning. Another instance is when Sam and Josh discuss Chris and Ashley's relationship status. Depending on what choice you make, you will hear one of these lines.
I swear, they just need, like, something to bond over, you know, some sort of traumatic event to send them into each other's arms.
Or,
Well, neither, if he doesn't go for it, which, knowing Chris, he won't unless someone's holding a gun to his head.
both allude to Josh's plot and its crescendo moment. The Quarry is no different, with great foreshadowing lines as well, two of the most memorable coming from Caitlin, the first in Chapter 1.
One more night in the great outdoors might actually kill me.
Hey, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger.
And in Chapter 2,
You know, I just realized we may never see each other again after tonight.
foreshadowing for me is best when it goes under the radar. It's nothing too jarring or telling of what is to come, but when you do notice them, it feels like a small nod to the audience. But there is one other element that the Quarry loves to foreshadow time and time again. It likes to show the full moon. I would suggest an excessively large amount. Hunting during a full moon, knowing horror to a basic degree, points you, the player, in a very obvious direction. Wendigo, werewolves. The big reveal, the twist, is mostly spoiled for some, maybe more than just some, in the opening prologue. Our opening shot is a forest and a full moon. Shortly after, we locate the broken cage with a sign, Silas the Dog Boy. A growling beast in the campsite basement before another shot of a full moon. The game is very on the nose with its werewolf theme, which I think does the game a disservice. The mystery is already somewhat ruined, and we're now better informed than our player characters. So I would suggest both games do an excellent job of providing layers of intrigue and foreboding themes to keep the player invested in the developing narrative. But ultimately, the twist in Until Dawn of the actual monster, the Wendigos, and the slow build up towards them is far superior and better paced, whereas The Quarry loses something by being too excited to tell the player what the monster is. So for me, another point to Until Dawn. So as mentioned prior, Until Dawn's big twist is that the actual threat to our characters are Wendigos, not a guy with a flamethrower, an escaped psychotic convict, or ghosts, but a creature that originates from Algonquin folklore. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing over its skin, its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into the sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from suppurations of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. The visual design of the Wendigos in Until Dawn not only keeps them similar to how they are described in the folklore, but manages to bridge the gap with what we understand about the natural world. They're just humanoid enough that we recognise their characteristics, but with their elongated limbs, taller stature, and terrifying fangs, it's still something straight from a nightmare. What really helps us, as an audience, believe in these supernatural creatures is that we also get to learn how the curse takes hold of its host when travelling through the sanatorium. The trapped miners slowly afflicted by the cannibalistic curse begin to transform into their new monstrous forms, as doctors try to figure out what is occurring. The doctors can't figure it out either, and can only document what is taking place before the Wendigos eventually laid waste to the staff. We get to see how they clawed at their cells and suffered. It really continues to build up to their eventual reveal. One particularly awesome addition is we get to somewhat understand and experience the alteration from Hannah's perspective, who also becomes afflicted when desperate for food, eventually feasting upon her sister, Beth. Her note is not dissimilar to the infamous Resident Evil note, Itchy Tasty, as she loses grasp of her own thoughts. The Wendigo's movement is fascinating as well. Akin to that of a stop-motion cinema film, they move so quickly that it looks almost like frames are missing. It's unnatural and terrifying. This, in combination with excellent sound design, the creature's screech is an unfamiliar and animalistic sound, which is used to forebode the creature in the early stages of the game. We know there is something out there. We see through its unrecognisable perspective from time to time. So I would suggest Until Dawn does a particularly good job of bridging the supernatural world and that of what we understand, using the sanatorium to explore their curse with lots of accompanying world building and detail. I fully accept that the Wendigo curse exists in the game world. In contrast, we have The Quarry with its own horrific monster. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly. Hang on, I keep forgetting. Are we sure this isn't a Wendigo? The tufts of hair? Where? Okay, werewolf. Okay. The earliest musings of these bestial monsters can be found in Mesopotamian writings, first found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written somewhere between 2100 and 1200 BC. Werewolf-like curses, also known as lycanthropy, can be seen throughout history, from tales of ancient Greece with King Lycaon of Arcadia being transformed into a wolf by Zeus for his trickery. Stories also appear from the Middle Ages, such as in Les of Marie de France, where a nobleman named Bisclavette transforms into a wolf for 3 days each week. For a more detailed rundown of werewolf history, I recommend a video by Overly Sarcastic Productions, who do a great job of going through the history of werewolves. But generally, there's a great deal of variation of what constitutes as a werewolf. They can be sentient or feral, triggered by moonlight or not, be true to what a wolf looks like or a more human-wolf hybrid, a transmittable disease via bites or more curse-like bestowed by gods or magic. Some believe they could be tamed or repelled by wolfsbane or only be harmed by silver, and sometimes impervious to all forms of damage. The version we meet in The Quarry is transmitted via bites. Only by killing the werewolf that bit you can you rid yourself of the curse. And in The Quarry, the original werewolf is Silas, the White Wolf. Silas has bitten Caleb Hackett and dragged the entire Hackett family into this nightmare, as Caleb goes on to bite both his sister Kayleigh and his father Chris. A full moon triggers their transformations as well, which is a fairly sudden alteration. They feel some pain before their skin literally explodes off of their bodies, leaving a feral human-wolf hybrid in its wake. I personally hate this transformation altogether. Let's compare it to that of the transformation in An American Werewolf in London. much slower but more believable transition. And this for me is the werewolf problem in The Quarry. Not only does it look like a Wendigo with a few tufts of hair here and there, but it also doesn't feel real. I don't believe it. I'm not convinced of its lore. I feel like I question it more than anything else. Its transformation is unbelievable, and it makes you more critical of other aspects of the game. For example, one thing I couldn't get past is that a full moon occurs roughly every 28 days. The Quarry's summer camp takes place from the 24th of June till the 22nd of August. So somewhere around the 22nd of July, there was another full moon during camp, which went incredibly unnoticed. Now there are some suggestions that there is some kind of slumber party around this period, which might be the resolution, but it's so unclear that I remain unconvinced, especially given Kaylee and Caleb are roaming free during the course of our playthrough. What happened? I am having to make excuses and fill in the blanks in an already unbelievable situation. It hasn't earned narrative immersion in terms of its supernatural element for me. During your journey through Until Dawn, you encounter the red herrings of the psychopath, flamethrower guy, ghosts, etc. You barely see the Wendigo. You hear its screeches, you see its actions. The closest to an early sighting is a brief distance headshot of what looks like Gollum in the mineshaft. But the earliest you will encounter the full body of a Wendigo is Chapter 8 as Emily. The game mostly keeps you guessing, and the foreboding feeling is heavily utilised. It spends the entire game preparing for its reveal, breadcrumbing you information that all makes sense when the time comes. The werewolf's design is by no means bad. It's fine. You can have a lot of freedom with the lore of its behaviours, but unfortunately, the game fails to explain enough of the world itself. Silas's origin is a total mystery. Caleb and Kaylee's initial escape is a bit unclear, and the uneventful full moon during camp is questionable. I'm sure notes allude to the answers, but I've played it 4 times and still don't fully know what's going on. Werewolves never feel real in the game world, so I struggle to immerse myself within it. So obviously, point Until Dawn again. In a game where the core mechanic is player agency, it is important that player-made decisions are well informed and made with intentional purpose. Enabling intentionality is at the heart of all immersive sim gameplay, level design, and system design. If an interactive narrative game is going to immerse a player into the world, it is imperative that designers utilise the concept of intentionality. As we discussed in Chapter 1, information is key for players to make intentional choices towards their goal. So let's explore how effective both games are at giving a sense of intentionality. In Until Dawn, dialogue options are direct, but also give the player a little more information about what type of dialogue you can expect. Your options are made clear, such as provoke and diffuse. These are accompanied with simple phrases which indicate the tone and direction the conversation will take. That's uncalled for, Jess. And chill out, Emily. You get the idea of what Matt is going to say and to who. Outside of this are more activity-driven choices, which provide the player with easy to understand actions they can take. For example, run or hide. A player might consider what their situation is. It strikes me as a terrible idea to try and outrun a Wendigo, for example, so I'm more likely to hide. And in that tense minigame, if I move and get caught, again, it will be on my head. I'm at fault. When making decisions which are so high stakes, it is integral that the player understands and feels at fault for any consequences of their actions, else it can feel unfair. And a lot of the time, information is key to this. But not every choice can be as simple as run or hide. You need there to be more divisive decisions that have unforeseeable ripple effects later in the story. A chosen path can be mysterious, but the player should have some information to instruct a logical direction. For instance, in Until Dawn Chapter 8, I found myself as Emily fleeing a Wendigo. I found myself at a crossroads with only a sign before me. I could go left or go right. I couldn't see the pointed direction, which meant Emily's head must be blocking the arrow's head, which meant I should go left to find the elevator, which might lead me to freedom. I didn't know for certain, but I can make a logical decision with the information on screen. Until Dawn also provides various totems to help inform the player further, in particular the guidance totems. These give hints to the player on specific upcoming situations, examples of being cautious of putting your hand into a trap, highlighting important locations like the water wheel, or being kind to the wolf. These do not reduce the player's feeling of agency because you are still free to choose, but do empower the player when they recognise the scene and use the totem information to make the best decision. It's a similar light bulb-like feeling to finding the heart key in Resident Evil and knowing where to go next. Simple, but effective. Though, not every totem gives you all the information you might need, such as one of the guidance totems makes it clear to give Matt the flare gun. What's interesting is there's a somewhat hidden path to protecting Matt, which involves him not wanting to go to the radio tower. If you play him in an agreeable fashion who follows Emily's word, he will simply waste the flare gun when given it, which can feel a little frustrating, because with the information at hand, I felt like I had made the correct choices. Matt made a decision which fell outside of my control. In this case, had the game not guided my path at all, I might not have been so disappointed by the outcome and had been more inclined to blame my own choices. There is a fine line to providing the player too much information or not enough. It's a challenging balance. There is also the illusion of choice we discussed back in Chapter 1. This is the idea of tricking the player into thinking their decisions have meaning. And there are no greater examples in Until Dawn than both Mike and Sam. Both are unkillable until the final pivotal moment in the game. This has both pros and cons. For example, you will see the game play out to its fullest, the full story to some degree, but on consecutive playthroughs, it can be a little disappointing to realise a lot of your actions, as these two characters, were meaningless. But this is a rather small gripe given it is completely unnoticeable really until you're actively trying to kill them. The Quarry works in much of the same way. The player is given multiple choices with the goal being to keep the characters alive. A certain amount of information is granted to the player but in a somewhat different format. Instead, the Quarry uses more emotionally driven language, being honest or mischievous, or desperate or terrified. These are accompanied by some small indicator of what these options could allude to, much like Until Dawn. In the case of desperate or terrified, these have extra details of okay, hang on, and no way, informing the player what actions will follow. So from a conversational perspective, you've got all the information you might need. However, this can be quite different when making more action-based choices. For instance, as Laura, during a battle with Jedediah, you are given the option to attack or run. If you choose run, this apparently means turn off the house's power and then run. Which, if you've left poor Jacob in the holding cells, he's unfortunately going to fall victim to Nick in full wolf form, which felt a little unfair in my first playthrough. I didn't feel like I was given all the information I needed. Instead of totems, the Quarry also provides the player with various tarot cards, which at the end of each chapter, one can be selected to give a vision of the future. Though, I don't think I was able to comprehend or use any of these visions in any productive manner. They provided no extra insight. As a result, some of my decisions left me feeling frustrated in my initial playthrough. It felt like my choices were not always intentional, and when it cost a character their life, it would feel unfair. The worst example of this, for me, was when Caitlin and Dylan are trapped in the kitchen with a werewolf. You can be prompted with run and freezer. With the information I had been given earlier in the game indicating the freezer might perhaps be an escape plus death trap, I chose to run, figuring at least one of them will get away, right? No. By run, they meant don't run, both stand there and die. And by freezer, they mean use the earlier found toy to trap the werewolf in the freezer. I would suggest more information could have helped these situations, such as with Laura and Jedediah, of run and switch off the power, or freezer, use toy. This would have given me more information to make a decision supported with more intentionality. As mentioned in Chapter 2, it is important that both strategic and meaningful choices are supported with a clear understanding of what the outcome of a decision will be to some degree. Had I been given more information and still made the wrong decision, the negative consequences would have felt more as a result of my own agency, but without that information, these moments just hurt my immersion and sense of flow. My choices felt less meaningful and more random. Speaking of, back to the concept of illusion of choice. In my opinion, The Quarry is really bad at covering up its meaningless choices. A lot of it shines through the characters and the lack of interactions they have regardless of their outcomes. Ryan's romance choice feels important at the time. Caitlin or Dylan, you're immediately invested. It's particularly nice to have some LGBT representation in a AAA title. But outside of the initial flirty comments, there's no payoff. Regardless of who Ryan chooses, it really makes no impact. The same could be said of Nick and Abigail's relationship. Live or die, there is no payoff. None of the character-based choices mean anything by the end. And on consecutive playthroughs, I am still a little mad that I felt like it was smart to not set off the fireworks, only to realise on later playthroughs, it makes no difference, it doesn't matter. So when it comes to dialogue, I would suggest although both games do a great job of allowing a player to make choices with purpose, The Quarry falls flat in terms of the choices meaning much. Ashley can at least kill Chris, for example, in Until Dawn.
Ash! What are you doing?
Activity-based decisions are occasionally a little disappointing in both, Until Dawn having some more difficult characters to keep alive, such as Matt, though the impact of this was mild because he is a somewhat criminally underdeveloped character, so you don't form a particularly strong bond with him. But this is perhaps the only example of something feeling unfair in Until Dawn. Whereas in The Quarry, it felt worse. When Jacob, Caitlin and Dylan all died in my playthrough, all three felt unjust. And this is before we discuss the conclusions. We discussed earlier how it's important that it is our own deductions that feel integral to the plot's development, and that our intentional choices should drive forward the resolution. Until Dawn naturally guides us back to the main cabin, and we deduce a plan alongside Sam and Mike before the final escape. But in The Quarry, it all felt a little rushed when suddenly all the dots were connected for us, with the White Wolf who just happens to be in town again. It felt quite rushed before suddenly the White Wolf was attacking our car as well, after being missing for months. It all felt really convenient and honestly really pulled me out of the game's story. My immersion and connection to the plot was ruined and it all just felt very unearned. So for me, Until Dawn, although not perfect, didn't give me the same feelings of frustration that unfortunately The Quarry produced throughout, with somewhat unintentional choices, a lack of impactful character relationships, and a rushed ending. So another point to Until Dawn. Now if you look through nearly all the previous chapters, you might have noticed something that even when writing this, I was a little surprised at. Until Dawn has better controller immersion, though this is at least partially due to the more direct integration with the PlayStation 4 controller. But even ignoring this, I would argue the controls are superior at connecting users' input to the on-screen action. I'd also suggest the plot in Until Dawn has a greater sense of mystery with twists and turns, which lead to a greater feeling of narrative immersion than The Quarry manages to achieve. A stronger feeling of dispositional alignment theory is realised with the cast of characters in Until Dawn because they have more depth and growth as the story develops, whereas in The Quarry, the characters, though more generally likeable, have less development from start to finish. Dr. Hill feels as though he has a greater impact on the gameplay and involves the player in the game world a lot more than Eliza, who feels like an addition to just keep within the traditional Supermassive Games structure. The foreboding in Until Dawn is also less on the nose than in The Quarry, which keeps that sense of mystery and intrigue and doesn't leave you waiting for the on-screen characters to catch up. Wendigos are almost undeniably better than The Quarry's werewolves. They're introduced in a more believable style, and their movement is horrifyingly great. Werewolves feel like a cheap version of the Wendigo, and their skin-bursting entrances are a little difficult to believe. And Until Dawn gives clearer information to their players when making decisions, leading to more intentional based decision making and less frustrating character deaths. So I know it seems like I'm just saying Until Dawn is a better game, and I kind of am, so let me just throw a dog a bone, pun very much intended by the way. The Quarry displays how far mocap has come. The lip syncing and character movements are incredible. Graphically speaking, the game is one of the most beautiful I've seen. The lighting in particular is very striking. There are moments in the game that are excellently presented. The scrapyard scene is one of the most exhilarating and memorable moments I've had in not just an interactive narrative, but gaming in general. The way the floodlights foretell the approaching threat, followed by the epic song choice, make for one of the most exciting scenes I've played through, where every choice and quick time event feels important to keeping Caitlin and Dylan alive. I am by no means suggesting The Quarry is a bad game, but it definitely cuts some corners when it comes to the excellent design the same developers have displayed in Until Dawn. Now, part of me wants to defend The Quarry because Until Dawn had Sony money behind it, but if you have money to pay big time actors like David Arquette, then you have money to pay designers and writers. Ultimately, Until Dawn is just more narratively well paced and structured. It provides a strong sense of mystery, and this along with its controls and gameplay better immerse the audience. Characters show more growth, and the world just feels more believable. I can see why both scored a Metacritic of 79. The gameplay is generally very similar, and it takes someone particularly critical, me, to really pull apart why something as simple as looking at an item and turning it makes such a difference. But audiences could feel that difference, which is why the audience score is so much higher for Until Dawn than it is for The Quarry. I will also note that there is a chance there is a certain degree of nostalgia. Until Dawn was a pioneer of the genre. It changed the game. It was a big deal, and The Quarry and the other Dark Pictures anthology games have mostly tried to recapture that magic. But what do you think? Do you feel that Until Dawn was more immersive? Are there elements of The Quarry I have perhaps overlooked? Which game do you think is best? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you again for watching, and if there's any other games you'd like to see more analysis of, do let me know. Thank you again to all of my awesome and very patient Patreons. Have a great day everyone, and don't eat people or free any dog boys.
Emily, I didn't know what was going to happen. None of us know.
There's no excuse. There's no excuse for
Emily,
this.
please, just try to understand.
Understand the palm of my hand, bitch.